The last day of death row. Inmate, Joseph Paul Franklin, America's most hated killer. Hi everyone. What does a man think about when he knows he won't see another sunrise? On November 20th, 2013, Joseph Paul Franklin, once dubbed America's most dangerous hate-driven killer, spent his final hours behind the cold steel doors of Missouri's death row. For over 3 decades, Franklin sat in silence, his name tied to a string of crimes that left a nation shaken. But when the end finally came, it wasn't with a bang. It was with an eerie calm, a last-minute legal twist, and a haunting silence that spoke louder than any final words ever could. No visitors, no apologies, just one man alone with the weight of his past. In this video, we take you inside the final 24 hours of Joseph Paul Franklin's life, a journey through the mind of a killer, the clock ticking down, and a justice system determined to see it through. What unfolded may shock you, and what he didn't say speaks volumes. Dear friends, the final 24 hours of Joseph Paul Franklin began not with chaos, but with a calm that was almost unnerving. On November 19th, 2013, as the gray morning light broke over the Potosi Correctional Center in Missouri, Franklin opened his eyes to his last day on Earth. No words were spoken. No sounds escaped his small, dimly lit cell. After decades on death row, the day he had fought so long to avoid had finally arrived. But there was no rage, no visible fear, only silence, the kind that made prison staff uneasy. Franklin had been placed on official death watch. That meant around-the-clock surveillance, lights never turned off, and guards stationed directly outside his cell, monitoring his every breath. While some inmates break under this intensity, Franklin did not. He rose from his bed slowly, deliberately, as if aware that every movement he made was now part of history. The man who once decided the fate of so many was now utterly powerless over his own. Born in 1950 in Mobile, Alabama, Franklin's life had been marked by instability from the start. A volatile home life, a strict and distant father, and a mother battling mental illness. All of it shaped a boy who would grow into a man consumed by isolation and hate. By the time he reached his 20s, he had embraced violent white supremacist ideologies and began targeting those who didn't fit into his distorted vision of the world. His crimes were not crimes of passion. They were calculated, deliberate, and fueled by the idea of racial purification. Over the years, Franklin confessed to more than 20 racially motivated killings. His targets were often strangers, interracial couples, black men, Jewish community leaders, people who had never wronged him, never crossed his path, except to exist. His acts of violence stretched across the country, from fire bombings of synagogues in Tennessee to sniper shootings in Pennsylvania and Georgia. Civil rights activist Vernon Jordan was one of his intended victims. 2 young cousins in Ohio, mistaken for a mixed-race couple, were among his fatal mistakes. He even shot a man in a fast food restaurant just because he was black and sitting near white patrons. Despite the nationwide manhunt and trail of destruction he left behind, Franklin eluded justice for years. It wasn't until 1980 that he was finally arrested, not for one of his murders, but for an attempted robbery in Missouri. This arrest turned out to be a break for law enforcement. His mugshot was circulated, and investigators began to piece together a horrifying puzzle. Ballistics evidence and witness testimonies eventually tied him to multiple killings. By 1985, he was convicted in Missouri and sentenced to death for the murder of Gerald Gordon, a respected member of a local synagogue. What followed were decades of litigation and confinement. Franklin, like many death row inmates, became an expert at using the legal system. He filed numerous lawsuits, challenging his conditions, the state's method of execution, and even the constitutionality of lethal injection itself. He claimed it was cruel and unusual, even as he remained silent about the cruelty of his own acts. In interviews, he claimed to have found God, to have renounced his hateful beliefs. But his victims' families weren't convinced. Words alone could not undo the pain. As November 19th wore on, Franklin's demeanor remained eerily calm. He showed no interest in a special last meal, choosing instead to eat a standard prison dinner: meatloaf, vegetables, potatoes. Witnesses said he barely touched the food. No one came to visit him. No family. No friends. He hadn't asked for anyone either. There were no spiritual advisors or clergy at his side. Just guards, fluorescent lights, and the sound of the clock ticking toward midnight. And then, a twist. At 2 p.m., word came that a federal judge had issued a temporary stay of execution. The court was questioning Missouri's use of pentobarbital, the drug intended to carry out Franklin's execution. There was a chance, however slim, that the process would be halted indefinitely. But Franklin didn't react. He neither smiled nor protested. Those around him said his face was blank, drained of emotion. Whether this was acceptance or emotional detachment, no one could tell. By nightfall, however, that reprieve was gone. A higher court overturned the stay, ruling that the execution could proceed. The clock resumed its countdown. There would be no more obstacles, no more appeals. The sentence, delayed for decades, would finally be carried out. At around 11:30 p.m., Franklin was escorted to the holding area just steps from the execution chamber. It was a sterile space, designed for silence and efficiency. He was fitted with restraints. A prison official asked if he had any final words. Franklin shook his head. There would be no apology, no last-minute plea for forgiveness. His silence in those final moments echoed louder than any statement he could have made. By 5:30 a.m., the preparations were complete. Franklin, dressed in a simple prison uniform and wearing his signature black-rimmed glasses, was led into the execution chamber. Witnesses watched through a glass pane as he was strapped onto the gurney. The room was cold, lit harshly by overhead lights. A curtain separated the witnesses from the medical team preparing the injection. At 6:07 a.m., 5 grams of pentobarbital were administered into Franklin's veins. It was the first time Missouri had used a single drug protocol due to international pharmaceutical restrictions on execution drugs. Franklin blinked. He took a few deep, labored breaths. His chest rose and fell one final time. Then, stillness. At 6:17 a.m., Joseph Paul Franklin was declared dead. No crowds gathered outside, no protests or demonstrations. The prison grounds remained quiet. The moment met not with noise, but with silence. It was a quiet end to a life defined by violent noise. Missouri Governor Jay Nixon later released a statement acknowledging the pain Franklin had caused and the suffering of his victims. But for many, his death wasn't about closure. It was a reminder, a chilling reflection of what unchecked hatred can become. Franklin's final hours left behind a question that still lingers. Can justice ever truly be served in the shadow of so much hate? His death marked the end of one man's reign of terror, but the fear he instilled and the ideology he embraced continue to haunt society. There was no redemption, no visible remorse, just a man fading quietly from the world he once tried to destroy. And in that silence, perhaps, was the loudest message of all. Joseph Paul Franklin's final 24 hours closed the book on one of America's darkest stories, but not the legacy of pain he left behind. His silence in the face of death echoed louder than any confession. No apologies, no redemption, just a man alone, facing the end with the same cold detachment that defined his life. For the families of his victims, his execution may have offered a moment of justice, but not healing. Franklin's hatred didn't die with him. It lingers in the shadows, a stark warning of what can grow when intolerance goes unchecked. As we reflect on his final day, we're left with uncomfortable truths about justice, morality, and the power of ideology. Was it justice served, or just history closing a chapter? Thank you for watching. If you found this story powerful, hit like, subscribe for more true crime stories, and share your thoughts below. Do you believe his execution brought justice or left more questions behind?